The year was 1893. Willow Creek, a small insulated town nestled in the burgeoning industrial sprawl of upstate New York, was not a place accustomed to spectacle. Its lifeblood was the rhythm of the local textile mill, the chime of the church bell, and the low, predictable drone of small-town gossip. Yet, for the past 4 months, one house, a Gothic, faded Victorian on the edge of the old oak woods, had become the epicenter of a chilling, unsettling silence that even the nosiest neighbors dared not break. This was the home of Elias Thorne, the town's most respected, and recently its most withdrawn carpenter, his wife Clara, a woman of frail, almost spectral beauty, and their 2 young sons, Caleb, 8, and Ethan, 6. The silence was the problem. Not the silence of a well-kept, quiet home, but an unnatural vacuum where the bright, boisterous sounds of 2 boys should have been. Caleb and Ethan, once known for their relentless energy, their games of catch that often spilled into Mrs. O'Malley's prized petunias, and their infectious laughter, had simply vanished from public sight. They had been ailing. Clara had told the few neighbors who had dared to inquire a vague, disquieting explanation that Elias, his face perpetually etched with fatigue and a fear he couldn't articulate, had confirmed with a curt nod. The initial concern morphed slowly into creeping suspicion, fueled by the small, almost imperceptible changes in the Thorne household. A peculiar sickly sweet odor, cloying, almost floral, yet underscored by something profoundly organic and wrong, began to waft from the sealed parlor windows on warm afternoons. Elias stopped going to the mill entirely, a financial impossibility for a man of his standing. He would be seen in the dead of night, hauling large, heavy burlap sacks, filled, he claimed, with old scrap wood, to the mill's unused incinerator, his eyes sunken and vacant. One late October evening, the atmosphere in Willow Creek felt heavier than the usual autumn fog. Amelia Rutledge, a retired schoolmistress and the self-appointed moral compass of the neighborhood, finally broke. She had been the last person to see Caleb and Ethan healthy, delivering a pie she had baked to the Thorne home, only to be met by Clara's icy refusal at the door. "It's the smell, Thomas," Amelia confided in her husband Thomas as they sat in their dimly lit parlor, the sound of crickets the only interruption. "It's not rot. It's a kind of stagnation. And Elias, the poor man, looks like a ghost that's forgotten how to lie down. Something is grievously wrong in that house." Thomas, a man of practical mind and heavy reluctance, argued for caution. "Amelia, the woman is grieving. Elias told Reverend Davies the boys have a severe fever. We can't simply barge in on a private matter. This is 1893, not the Wild West. Fever? For 4 months? Thomas, they haven't seen a doctor. Not Dr. Abernathy, not anyone. The curtains are drawn tighter than a drum." "And the silence," Amelia stressed, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "It's a silence that screams." The next morning, armed with the quiet but firm conviction that a greater sin lay in inaction, Amelia bypassed her husband's objections. She approached Mr. Sterling, the town constable, a man whose main duties revolved around stray livestock and public intoxication, not domestic horrors. Sterling, a good-natured but unimaginative man, was initially dismissive. "Mrs. Rutledge, I understand your concern, but I cannot break the lock of a reputable citizen's home on the basis of a smell and drawn curtains. The boys are unwell, that is the explanation." Amelia leaned in, her eyes hard and unwavering, the very picture of moral authority. "Constable, I taught those boys their letters. They were full of life. Now, their father burns things in the dead of night, their mother is wasting away, and the house smells like a chemical experiment gone foul. I have a duty to ensure the welfare of those children, and so do you. If you will not come with me, I will go to the mayor, and I will tell him you were too cowardly to investigate a possible tragedy." The veiled threat, more than her moral pleas, moved Sterling. He relented, agreeing to accompany her to the Thorne residence under the pretense of a welfare check authorized by the mayor. The walk to the house felt like a solemn procession. The air grew perceptibly cooler as they neared the Victorian. The lawn, usually neatly trimmed by Elias, was overgrown and sickly brown. A layer of grey dust coated the windows, and the entire structure seemed to sag under the weight of an untold secret. Constable Sterling knocked once, then twice, the sound echoing hollowly in the vast, empty porch. After a minute of agonizing silence, the door opened a crack. Clara Thorne stood there. She was a ruin. Her once bright red hair was dull and matted, her face pale and drawn, her eyes wide, ringed with dark shadows that spoke of sleepless nights and relentless terror. She wore a heavy, thick velvet dressing gown, despite the mild autumn temperature. "Mrs. Thorne," Sterling began, attempting a professional, measured tone. "Mrs. Rutledge and I are here on behalf of the mayor. We simply need to see the children, confirm they are being cared for, and offer any assistance." Clara's lips barely moved as she spoke, her voice a dry, rasping whisper. "They are resting. The fever is stubborn. They cannot be disturbed. The doctor, he said absolute rest." Amelia stepped forward, her heart pounding. "Clara, please, just a moment. Let us see Caleb and Ethan." For a brief, terrible moment, a flicker of something monstrous, pure, desperate panic, crossed Clara's face. She moved to slam the door shut, but Constable Sterling, sensing the sudden shift from reserve to raw fear, was quicker. He forced his boot into the jamb and pushed. The door gave way with a sickening thud. The immediate rush of air was a physical blow. The sickly sweet cloying odor hit them with a force that made Amelia gasp and Sterling reel back, hands instinctively covering his nose and mouth. It was a chemical stench, sharp like formaldehyde, yet mingled irrevocably with something foul and metallic. The entry hall was immaculate, almost disturbingly so, but the stench led them irresistibly toward the parlor, a room Elias had recently sealed off with heavy drapery nailed across the archway. Sterling, drawing his pistol, a rare, unnerving sight in Willow Creek, tore the drapes down with a mighty rip. The sight that greeted them was instantly, irrevocably wrong. The room was hot, humid, and still. Every window was sealed shut with thick layers of waxed paper. In the center of the room sat a large, velvet-upholstered divan, its normally rich crimson fabric now stained a disturbing dark rust color. And on the couch, where Caleb and Ethan should have been playing or recovering, was a distorted, unrecognizable mass. Two small shapes, impossibly fused to the fabric of the sofa, were barely discernible. They were not bodies in the usual sense. The material of the couch had seemingly consumed them. Their skin was translucent and unnaturally smooth, stretched taut and faintly yellowed, adhering to the velvet like a grotesque, melted wax figure. Amelia's cry was sharp, a sound of pure, unadulterated terror. Sterling, a man who had seen death, but never this, stood frozen, his pistol trembling. The chemical odor was overwhelmingly strong here, and it was suddenly horribly clear. The boys hadn't just been neglected, they had been preserved, or worse. The horrifying truth of the title, Mother Who Melted Her Sons into the Couch, seemed to manifest in this sickening, unbelievable tableau. Clara, who had followed them, stood in the doorway, her composure returning with a chilling, vacant calm. She did not look at the figures on the couch, but straight at the terrified constable and the sobbing schoolmistress. "They needed to be still," she murmured, her eyes wide and wet, absolutely still. "The world was too loud for my precious boys." The immediate terror was the image. The deep, festering mystery was how and why. What process, what chemical cocktail, what unimaginable cruelty had turned two living, breathing boys into this horrific domestic sculpture? This was not the work of a disease or a simple accident. This was meticulous, calculated madness. Constable Sterling finally found his voice, a raw, strangled command. "Mrs. Thorne, you are under arrest." Clara did not resist. As Sterling moved to secure her, Amelia stood transfixed by the sight on the couch, her mind racing past the horror of the bodies to the deeper, colder horror of the environment. The room was not simply hot and sealed. There were strange, small chemical stains on the floorboards and a lingering, acrid scent beneath the sickly sweet floral one. The police would soon arrive. The town would be shocked, and the initial report would be dismissed as the ravings of a mad woman. But Amelia, wiping tears from her eyes, knew that the surface horror of the mother who melted her sons was only the beginning. The boys were not merely melted, they had been submerged in something. The true weapon, the process, and the motive, a motive beyond simple insanity, were still lurking in the shadows of the sealed parlor. The investigation was just beginning, and the simple story of a mother's madness was about to unravel into a terrifying tapestry of secrets. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next chapter of this chilling true crime mystery. The initial police investigation was a maelstrom of confusion and horror. Detective Arthur Hayes, a sharp, ambitious man from the city, was immediately dispatched, recognizing the sensational nature of the crime. Willow Creek, accustomed to petty theft, was ill-equipped for this level of gruesome, calculated violence. The focus instantly fell on Clara, the seemingly insane mother. Detective Hayes, however, was a man who looked past the obvious. The scene was too meticulously constructed to be the spontaneous act of a lunatic. He ignored the fearful whispers of the townsfolk gathered outside, the photographer's flashes, and the distraught Amelia Rutledge, and focused on the facts of the sealed parlor. The first fact was the smell. Dr. Abernathy, finally brought in, confirmed Hayes's suspicion. The dominant scent was a mixture of industrial chemicals, specifically a compound of phenol and cresol, often used for powerful preservation, mixed with an unnervingly high concentration of aniline dye. This chemical cocktail, when heated and applied repeatedly over time, would first degrade the organic material, the children's skin and soft tissue, and then, aided by the heat and the sealing of the room, effectively fuse the remnants to the porous velvet fibers of the couch. It was preservation through a gruesome, aggressive embalming, a horrifying slow-motion mummification. The sickly sweet, floral smell, Hayes hypothesized, was Clara's desperate attempt to mask the acrid chemical burn. The second fact was the apparatus. In the corner of the room, tucked behind a heavy screen, Hayes found two objects. A large, repurposed tea kettle with a copper coil attached to its spout, and a set of custom-made syringes, not for injection, but for thick liquid application. The tea kettle suggested the heating of the chemicals to increase their efficacy and dispersal within the sealed room, creating a suffocating, toxic atmosphere. The boys had likely been subjected to a horrifying, prolonged chemical misting. Clara, now confined in the Willow Creek jail, refused to speak, her silence deeper and colder than any confession. She merely rocked back and forth, muttering softly. Still. They needed to be still. Hayes turned his attention to Elias Thorne, the withdrawn father. Elias was found incoherent, huddled in his workshop behind the house, surrounded by his beautiful, meticulous carpentry tools. He was brought in for questioning, his face a mask of profound, uncomprehending grief. Mr. Thorne, Hayes began, leaning forward in the cramped station house. Your wife has committed an unspeakable act. We need to know what she was doing, the chemicals. Where did she get the phenol, the aniline dye? Elias stared blankly, his voice a dry rasp. I don't know. Clara was always delicate. After our third child was stillborn last year, she changed, distant, obsessed with stillness, with preventing change. Did you not notice the smell, the drawn curtains, the fact that your boys were wasting away? Hayes pressed, his voice sharp with professional impatience. Elias broke then, a ragged sob tearing through him. I saw, I smelled. But she told me they had a rare fever, that the air had to be controlled. She locked the parlor. She only allowed me to see them in the dim light. They were so pale, Detective, so very still. She said it was the cure. I was so exhausted from working, from trying to keep us afloat after I lost my mill contract. I believed her. I wanted to believe her. Hayes didn't believe the full extent of Elias's innocence. Elias had burned the sacks. Elias had been complicit in the secrecy. What was in the sacks you burned at the mill incinerator, Mr. Thorne? Elias's eyes widened, a flicker of genuine terror mixing with his grief. It was old clothes, bedding, things contaminated by the fever, Clara insisted. She was terrified of the contagion spreading. A knock on the door interrupted them. Sterling brought in a small, neatly bound notebook found in Clara's bedside drawer. It was not a diary, but a ledger, written in a cramped, precise hand. It detailed not personal thoughts, but meticulous chemical purchases and deliveries. Hayes scanned the entries. The chemicals were all industrial grade, purchased in bulk, and delivered directly to the Thorne residence. The seller, the Albany Supply Co. The dates of the purchases coincided exactly with the boy's disappearance from public view. Mr. Thorne, Hayes said, holding up the ledger. Clara ordered industrial chemicals. She paid for them. Where did she get the money? You said you were struggling financially. Elias hesitated, a terrible truth struggling to emerge. The house, Clara. She inherited money from her estranged Uncle Robert a few months ago. He was a chemist. He died alone in Albany, a substantial amount. She said it was our salvation. The revelation was a significant turn. Clara had the money, she had the means, and now the expertise. Hayes knew that Uncle Robert's connection to chemistry was no coincidence. He needed to go to Albany. The focus shifted from the mad mother to the mad method. The mystery was no longer who, but how the chemical process was refined, and crucially, was there something in the inheritance, in Uncle Robert's past, that had provided Clara with this horrific formula? Before leaving the station, Hayes demanded one last piece of evidence from the Thorne house, the velvet couch itself. He had a hunch about the adhesion. The boys hadn't just melted into the couch. The couch itself seemed to have reacted with them. The final element of the parlor that Hayes examined was the underside of the couch. Hidden beneath the skirt of the divan, he found a small, almost invisible brass valve leading to a thin, concealed rubber tube that snaked under the floorboards. The tube ran directly into a small, subfloor compartment. Opening the compartment, Hayes found a shallow, empty metal tank. The tank had residue that smelled strongly of the chemicals and something else. A thick, viscous, oily substance. The implication was terrifying. The couch wasn't just a resting place, it was a chemical saturation device. The boys hadn't been preserved passively. They had been subjected to a continuous forced chemical bath, applied not just as a mist, but pumped up from below through the upholstery itself. The mother's desperate desire for stillness had been realized through a terrifying industrial-grade process, perfected by a knowledge she didn't possess on her own. The investigation was now a race to uncover Uncle Robert's chemical secret before the town simply closed the case on insanity. Detective Hayes traveled immediately to Albany, the state capital, a chaotic, sprawling city compared to the quiet desolation of Willow Creek. His target, Uncle Robert, the estranged chemist whose legacy provided both the means and the knowledge for Clara's crime. Hayes found the records for Robert Vance, Clara's maternal uncle, who had died 6 months prior. Vance had been a man of obscurity, a brilliant but disgraced academic. He had taught chemistry at a minor upstate college before being dismissed 5 years earlier for what the records vaguely termed unethical experimentation involving organic adhesion and pigmentation. Hayes tracked down Vance's last known residence and laboratory, a cramped, dilapidated building on the outskirts of Albany, masquerading as a taxidermist's supply warehouse. The landlord, a nervous, elderly man, allowed Hayes entry. The laboratory was a nightmare of rusted metal and forgotten reagents. The air was thick with the ghost of chemical fumes. Hayes searched through dusty shelves and cluttered workbenches, finding the familiar chemicals mentioned in Clara's ledger: phenol, aniline, cresol. Then he found the journals. Robert Vance's research notes, bound in thick leather covers, detailing years of his work. The notes were written in an increasingly frantic hand, charting his obsession: the permanence of form. Vance's theoretical work was horrifyingly specific. He believed that the human form, especially the pliable, less developed tissue of children, was too ephemeral. His initial experiments were with animals, attempting to create permanent, chemically preserved, yet aesthetically vibrant displays that defied decay. He had developed a process he termed forma stabilis, a compound that, when heated and continuously applied, would slowly replace the water and soft cellular structure with a synthetic polymer, effectively turning organic matter into a hardened, pigmented resin permanently fused to whatever surface it rested upon. He specifically noted the reaction between his compound and velvet upholstery due to its high fiber density. Hayes felt a chill that transcended the cold reality of the lab. This was not mere insanity, it was a perversion of science. One key detail in the journal stood out. Vance had been struggling to perfect the catalyst. The chemical mixture was effective, but the application was too slow, the infusion incomplete. The final few pages of his last journal, dated 3 months before his death, detailed a breakthrough: a refined catalyst derived from a rare metallic mineral compound found only in certain deep clay deposits near Willow Creek. The journal entry read, "The clay sample from the Thorn Land, a gift from my nephew Elias, has yielded the key. Its high mineral content accelerates the forma stabilis by a factor of 10. The process is now viable. A complete permanent adhesion can be achieved in 4 months under controlled temperature and saturation. The specimen will be still, forever." Elias Thorn was the link. He was a carpenter. He worked with materials including clay and earth for mixing plaster and concrete. He had provided the key ingredient, the mineral catalyst, to his estranged uncle, completely unaware of its purpose. Hayes immediately wired Willow Creek. Elias Thorn was not just an exhausted husband, he was an unwitting accomplice. Returning to the station in Willow Creek, Hayes found Elias still in custody, looking even more defeated. Hayes presented the information calmly, his professional detachment serving as a weapon. "Mr. Thorn, your wife's uncle, Robert Vance, was a chemist obsessed with the permanence of form. His research led to the compound used on your sons. He was looking for a catalyst, a rare mineral from your land, which you supplied to him, correct?" Elias stared, utterly shattered. "The clay. He said he needed a sample for a pigment test. He paid well. I thought nothing of it. He was family. And the money, Mr. Thorn? The inheritance." Vance died, and a few weeks later, Clara received a substantial sum. "We believe it was payment. Not an inheritance, but a final large payment for the formula and the necessary supplies. Did you see any correspondence between Clara and Vance before his death?" Elias shook his head, tears streaming. "No letters. Wait. A package. Right before Uncle Robert died. A wooden chest. Clara took it immediately to the parlor. Locked it away." Hayes now had a clearer, more terrifying picture. Clara wasn't just a madwoman. She was a student. Vance, knowing he was dying, had sold the formula, the knowledge, and the initial supply of the catalyst to his niece, the only person he believed would embrace his horrific vision of permanence. The inheritance was a transaction. The true antagonist, however, remained Clara. Hayes needed to break her silence. He needed to understand the motive behind her willingness to execute this scientific horror. He left Elias to his grief, knowing the father was a victim of deception, and walked toward Clara's cell. The air in the station house felt toxic, heavy with the weight of scientific madness made manifest in domestic terror. Detective Hayes entered Clara's cell. The room was small, cold and dimly lit, offering no comfort. Clara was sitting upright on the cot, perfectly still, her eyes focused on a distant internal horizon. Hayes pulled up a chair, settling into the long psychological wait. He didn't speak of the law or the crime. He spoke of the parlor. "The room was sealed so perfectly, Clara. It was like a tomb, but you kept it warm. You went in there every day, didn't you? To perform the treatment." Clara remained motionless for a minute, then slowly, a faint, dry smile touched her lips. They were safe. Finally. The noise. The incessant, loud, shattering noise of the world. It couldn't reach them there. The dust. The dirt. The change. Hayes leaned in, his voice low, almost conversational. Change is inevitable, Clara. Children grow. They get sick. They grow up and leave. That's life. No. Her voice suddenly rose, sharp and furious, before immediately receding to the chilling whisper. Not mine. Not after Elsie. Hayes recognized the name. Elsie was the third child, the daughter, stillborn a year prior. This was the core wound, the true psychological catalyst. Tell me about Elsie, Clara. She was perfect, quiet, still. The doctor took her away. He said she was an error, an unformed thing, but she was the most beautiful. The world ruined her by making her live for such a short time. My boys were loud. They broke things. They had fevers. They played in the mud. I saw the life leaving Elsie, and I knew the world would eventually take Caleb and Ethan too, either slowly through illness or quickly through a fall. They would change. I couldn't bear it. This was the terrifying logic of her madness, not malice, but an overwhelming, desperate need to preserve a moment in time, to deny mortality through a hideous scientific permanence. Hayes pulled out Robert Vance's journal, deliberately setting it on the cot between them. Your uncle taught you how to stop the change. He sent you his formula, Forma Stabilis. He told you how to make the couch into a permanent pedestal. Clara's hand reached out and touched the leather cover of the journal almost reverently. Robert understood. He sent me the knowledge, the supplies. He called it a gift. He said it was the only way to defeat the ephemeral nature of flesh. The money was simply to ensure I had everything I needed to finish the work. Hayes pressed the crucial point. The boys were sick, weren't they? They developed a high fever, just as you told the neighbors. That's when you started the treatment. But the Forma Stabilis isn't a cure, Clara. It's a chemical embalming. It must have caused them terrible pain. Clara looked away, a cloud passing over her eyes. There was pain. At first, the heat and the stinging. Caleb cried, and Ethan whispered he wanted his papa. I told them to close their eyes. I told them it was the sleep of stillness. I played their favorite lullabies, the fever and the solution. Eventually the pain stopped. They became calm, and then they became permanent. Her confession was not one of remorse, but of successful, if macabre, achievement. The psychological terror was the realization that she had acted out of a grotesque, distorted form of maternal love, a desire to hold on to her children so tightly that she rendered them into eternal, immutable objects. Hayes, feeling the cold weight of the tragedy, shifted his attention to the final loose end. Elias. Why did you involve Elias in the secrecy? Why did you make him burn the evidence? Elias was afraid of the change too, Clara whispered, looking back at Hayes. He feared the shame of our ruin. He was weak. He wanted to believe the fever story. But he knew the truth. When he saw how still they were becoming, he was horrified. I told him he had to choose, help me or lose them to the world's decay. He chose to help me hide the process. He was my carpenter. He sealed the room. Hayes now saw the true, horrific dynamic. Elias was not just an unwitting accomplice. He was a willing collaborator in the cover-up, coerced by his wife's psychological manipulation and his own denial and fear of losing his status. The sacks he burned were not just old clothes. They were initial failed experiments, the remnants of the earliest, most painful stages of the Forma Stabilis treatment. Hayes left the cell. The image of the permanent still figures on the couch, now overlaid with the painful final moments of the boys' lives. The case was closed legally, a clear case of murder. But the deeper psychological mystery remained. How could a loving father allow himself to be so paralyzed by fear and denial that he became complicit in his children's living death? The next step was to confront Elias with Clara's statement and force him to own his involvement in the ultimate cover-up. Detective Hayes returned to Elias Thorne, who was now being held in a separate room, officially listed as a person of interest. due to his admitted knowledge of the sealed room. Hayes began by presenting Clara's confession, a detailed account of the former Stabilis process, Robert Vance's formula, and Elias's role in supplying the clay catalyst and sealing the parlor. Elias listened, his face pale, his hands gripping the edge of the table until his knuckles were white. When Hayes finished, the room descended into a heavy silence, broken only by Elias's shallow, ragged breathing. She lied. Elias finally managed, his voice weak. She convinced me of the fever. I sealed the room because she said the drafts would kill them. I burned the things because she was afraid of contamination. Hayes pushed back, the intensity of his gaze unforgiving. Mr. Thorne, you are a carpenter. You are a man of materials. You saw the couch. You smelled the chemicals. You saw your sons wasting away, turning translucent, and you accepted the explanation of a fever that lasts 4 months? Clara's account is meticulously detailed, supported by the chemical ledger and the lab findings. She claims you knew, that you were simply too afraid to stop her. Elias's carefully constructed facade of the grieving, naive father began to crack. His denial was loud, but his eyes held the deep, terrible truth. He knew. I tried to talk to her. He burst out, his voice choked with years of suppressed terror. When they started to stick to the couch, when their skin became like wax, I told her to stop. I told her it was a sin against God. And what did she say? Hayes prompted. Elias slumped, defeated. She said the world had failed Elsie and I would not allow it to fail her brothers. She showed me the journal. She explained the permanence. She said if I went to the police, I would be ruining her great achievement, that I would be condemning their memory to decay and rot, and that the world would know me as the father who destroyed his wife. Hayes realized the terrifying genius of Clara's control. She hadn't used physical force. She had used the profound psychological terror of social ruin and eternal decay. For a man of 1893 Willow Creek, reputation was everything. Elias was paralyzed by the fear of being branded a failure, a man who couldn't control his wife, or worse, a collaborator in a scientific perversion. The heavy burlap sacks, Elias, the ones you burned in the dead of night. What was truly inside them? Hayes asked, his voice now a low, dangerous growl. Elias trembled violently, finally giving up the last vestige of his lie. The earliest attempts. Clara made mistakes with the compound. Before she got the catalyst, the process was messy. There were fragments of bedding, and Caleb's blanket, the one he loved. It was stuck to a section of the sofa that she had to cut out. I had to dispose of the failures. She threatened to expose me to the town, to say I was the one experimenting on them. This detail was the turning point. Elias hadn't just covered up the crime, he had disposed of the evidence of the process. He was an accessory after the fact, motivated by self-preservation and a profound, cowardly denial. Hayes brought in Amelia Rutledge, the former schoolmistress, the woman who had forced the investigation. Amelia was a pillar of the community, and her presence was a stark moral mirror. "Mr. Thorne," Amelia said, her voice steady but laced with deep sadness, "I know you. You built my library shelves. You are a good carpenter. How could you allow the boys to suffer like that? Their little bodies." Elias looked at Amelia, and the full weight of his actions finally crushed him. He saw the genuine, unvarnished horror in a neighbor's eyes, not the judgment of the law. I should have gone to the police," he sobbed, burying his face in his hands. "I should have broken down the door. I should have done anything but listen to her. I was afraid of the truth. I was afraid of losing my life, my reputation. I failed them. I failed Caleb and Ethan. I am a monster." Elias's confession, finally extracted, was not a legal one, but a moral and psychological surrender. He confirmed every detail of Clara's story, admitting that his fear of societal shame outweighed his parental duty. He was now an official accomplice. The town, already reeling from the horrific discovery of the melted boys, now had to confront the devastating truth. The crime was not a simple act of a solitary madwoman. but a slow, calculated domestic terror allowed to flourish through the cowardice and complicity of the father. The psychological shock was immense. The Thorne home, once a symbol of Willow Creek stability, was now a monument to the darkest secrets fear could foster. The final chapter of the investigation was about to open. The public, sensational trial. The trial of Clara Thorne, and the subsequent legal focus on Elias Thorne as an accessory, became the biggest sensation in New York State in 1893. Reporters flocked to Willow Creek, transforming the quiet town into a crucible of morbid curiosity. The case was immediately dubbed the Former Stabilis Murders, a testament to the chilling scientific method used. The prosecution, led by the astute district attorney, focused on the meticulous nature of the crime, presenting Robert Vance's journal, Clara's chemical ledger, and Detective Hayes's detailed reconstruction of the sealed parlor. The description of the children, permanent still, fused to the crimson velvet divan, was delivered with clinical coldness, maximizing the horror for the jury. Clara's defense attorney, a young, earnest lawyer assigned the unenviable task, relied solely on the plea of insanity. He argued that no sane mother could commit such an act. He detailed the trauma of the stillborn Elsie, the financial and emotional stress on the family, and claimed Clara was driven to a psychological break, obsessed with preserving her sons from the decay of the world. Clara, throughout the proceedings, remained the picture of unsettling composure. She rarely spoke, occasionally offering a cryptic, distant smile when the permanent status of her sons was mentioned. Her testimony was brief, repeating the core of her confession. "I simply stopped the change. They are now perfect and still. The world cannot touch them." The psychological suspense in the courtroom was palpable. The jury was torn between the obvious horror of the act and the unsettling nature of the motive. Was this evil, or was it the ultimate expression of a mind shattered by grief? The most damaging testimony came from Detective Hayes, who detailed the progression of the treatment and, crucially, the involvement of Elias. Hayes explained that the process was not immediate. It was a slow, deliberate misting and saturation over weeks, a period during which the children would have suffered immensely. Then came Elias Thorne's testimony. Pale, withered, and barely recognizable, he was forced to recount his actions, the disposal of the failed attempts, the sealing of the parlor, the terror that paralyzed him. "I heard them sometimes," Elias whispered, his voice cracking with dry, exhausted grief. "Whispering for water. I knew they were in pain. Clara would give them a sweet drink and tell them to close their eyes for the sleep of stillness. I convinced myself it was the fever. I convinced myself I was protecting my family's name." The district attorney's cross-examination was brutal, highlighting Elias's self-interest. "Mr. Thorne, you chose your reputation over your children's lives. You were a carpenter. You could have easily broken the lock. You chose to be a part of the cover-up. You saw the terror in your son's eyes and did nothing to disrupt your wife's horrific process. Is that not correct?" Elias could only nod, a broken, defeated figure. "I was a coward. A terrible, selfish coward. They needed a father, and I gave them silence." The case against Clara was overwhelming. The jury deliberated for only 4 hours. They rejected the claim of simple insanity, concluding that the meticulous planning, the sourcing of the unique catalyst, and the construction of the saturation couch demonstrated a terrifying level of rational, though perverted, calculation. Clara Thorne was found guilty of first-degree murder. The fate of Elias Thorne, the accessory, was equally impactful. The town and the jury felt a deep moral revulsion toward his complicity. He was found guilty of being an accessory to murder, not for the act itself, but for his prolonged, fearful failure to intervene and his destruction of evidence. The sentencing was delivered by a stern judge who spoke not only of the law, but of the profound moral failure that had allowed this domestic terror to persist. Clara was sentenced to life imprisonment. Elias received a 10-year sentence, the judge stating, "Your punishment, Mr. Thorne, is not merely the cage, but the knowledge that you stood outside the door and listened as your sons were slowly chemically erased. The story, however, was not over. The trial had forced the town to look inward, examining the societal pressures of reputation, shame, and the fear of change that had driven both Clara's madness and Elias's cowardice. Detective Hayes, now a recognized figure, felt a deep disquiet. He had solved the who, the what, and the how, but the true horror, the possibility of an even darker secret lurking in the Thorns' past, still clung to him like the phantom smell of phenol. The investigation, Hayes knew, must continue into the psychological scars of the Thorn family history. Despite the closure of the trial, Detective Hayes found himself unable to shake the case. The psychological darkness of the Thorn household felt incomplete. He returned to the remnants of the Thorn property, now sealed and awaiting auction, on a cold, grey December morning. He was searching for the one thing that still didn't fit, a motive deep enough to explain Clara's almost ecstatic embrace of scientific murder. The loss of Elsie was profound, but the level of calculated cruelty suggested a deeper, older wound. Hayes revisited Elias's workshop, the detached, meticulously organized space where he had first found the broken father. Elias was a carpenter of precision, a man who documented every cut and every contract. Hayes was searching not for tools, but for personal documents, something that predated the former Stabilis formula. Tucked into a hidden compartment beneath the main workbench, a compartment Elias, in his panic, must have forgotten. Hayes found an envelope, yellowed with age, postmarked nearly 15 years prior. It was an unsent letter, addressed in Clara's youthful hand to her mother, who had died young. The letter was a fragile, devastating document, written when Clara was just a teenager. It detailed not her life, but the secret, persistent cruelty inflicted upon her by her own father. The father had been a cold, demanding man, obsessed with perfection and order. The letter read, in part, "Father says I am too messy, too loud, that my emotions make the house unstable. He makes me sit on the hard, wooden chair for hours in the dark, telling me I must achieve perfect stillness. He says only things that are still are safe from shame. He took away all my colored dresses, saying bright things attract the eye of ruin. I hate the quiet, mother. I hate the stillness. I wish I could run away, but he watches me. He watches for the slightest movement, the smallest sound." Hayes felt a wave of profound sorrow. Clara's madness wasn't spontaneous. It was inherited trauma, a seed planted in a terrifying childhood of forced silence and emotional abuse. Her father's obsession with perfect stillness had metastasized into her own horrific adult obsession. The couch wasn't just a resting place. It was a twisted recreation of her own childhood punishment, but applied to her children to save them from the imperfections of life. The letter also mentioned a recurring point of conflict, a specific, valuable family heirloom, a large antique ceramic doll that Clara was forbidden to touch. Her father cherished it because it was immutable, perfect, and still. Any time Clara misbehaved, he would make her watch him polish the doll, lecturing her on the superiority of unmoving, permanent objects. Hayes now understood the deep psychological subtext. Clara was recreating her trauma, turning her beloved sons into the ultimate still objects. Objects immune to change, safe from her childhood fear of imperfection and her adult fear of loss. He returned to the empty Thorn house, searching the master bedroom for the ceramic doll. It was not there. The police inventory had not listed any such item. He found Clara's vanity covered in dust, and beneath a loose floorboard, a small, worn photograph of a severe-looking man, Clara's father, holding the very doll. It was a beautiful, unnervingly lifelike ceramic figure, draped in a deep crimson velvet dress. Hayes looked at the photograph, then back at the dark rust stain on the floorboards leading to the sealed parlor. The color of the doll's dress was the exact color of the velvet couch. The connection was clear. Clara had modeled the ultimate stillness device, the couch, after the image of her father's perfect, unmoving object of obsession. The question was, where was the doll? Hayes pressed Constable Sterling to check the personal effects of Elias Thorne being held in storage. When Sterling checked the list, he found one unexamined item, a small, heavy wooden crate that Elias had insisted was filled with sentimental junk. Opening the crate, Hayes found the ceramic doll, carefully wrapped in thick cotton. It was beautiful, but its perfection was chilling. Tucked into the doll's velvet dress, Hayes found one final, small, rolled-up piece of parchment. It was not old. It was a note from Clara to Elias, written the night before the final, permanent treatment began. The note was short. "They are almost safe, Elias. Soon, the world will have no power over them. I have put the doll away. She is the witness to the final, perfect stillness. We are free from the chaos now." The doll was more than an object. It was a symbol of Clara's ultimate final victory over the trauma of her childhood, and Elias, by storing it, was keeping her perverse witness safe. He was not just a coward. He was a terrified man who still feared his wife's psychological power even after her arrest. Hayes closed the crate. The case was now psychologically complete. The crime was a chain reaction. Trauma led to madness. Madness found an outlet in perverse science, and fear led to complicity. The horror was entirely human, a terrifying exploration of how deeply the past can poison the present. If you're captivated by this chilling unraveling of human cruelty and trauma, please subscribe and hit that notification bell. We are nearing the conclusion, and you won't want to miss the final twists. With the trial and the full psychological profile of Clara complete, Detective Hayes turned his attention to the legacy of the Thorne family in Willow Creek. The town's reputation had been irrevocably damaged, and Hayes suspected the horror of the parlor was merely the peak of a deeper systemic rot. He returned to Amelia Rutledge, the former schoolmistress, now the town's reluctant hero. Amelia had taught both Thorne boys, and had known Elias and Clara since they were children. Hayes realized Amelia held the key to the town's collective memory, the secrets that everyone chose to ignore. "Mrs. Rutledge," Hayes said, meeting her in her quiet parlor, "I need to know what the town chose not to see. Before the stillbirth, before the chemicals, what was the Thorne family truly like?" Amelia sighed, a heavy, tired sound. Elias was always respected, a good provider. But the marriage, it was always brittle. Clara was too fragile for a man like Elias, who only valued practical, tangible things. He wanted a perfect home, perfect children. He wanted the world to see him as unflawed. "Did Elias ever show signs of anger or control?" Hayes asked. Amelia hesitated, glancing at the window. "Not anger, no. But control, absolutely. When Caleb, the older boy, was 5, he had a bad case of the measles. He was delirious and cried loudly for days. Elias moved the boy's cot into the shed. He told Clara the noise was disrupting the order of the house, and that Caleb needed quiet time to learn composure. Clara even then defended him, saying Elias was simply enforcing discipline. The revelation was chilling. Elias's control, his obsession with order, was a subtle echo of the psychological abuse Clara suffered from her own father. He hadn't been an entirely innocent victim of his wife's madness. He was a silent contributor to a suffocating environment of emotional repression and the fear of imperfection. His desire for a perfect, quiet home inadvertently created the conditions for Clara's ultimate act. Hayes then questioned Amelia about the period immediately following Elsie's stillbirth. Clara was destroyed naturally, but Amelia trailed off. Elias didn't cry. He became maniacally busy. He built a new fence around the garden. He repainted the entire parlor, the same parlor. He threw away all of Elsie's things. He told Clara, "We must erase the imperfection and proceed with the remaining 2. He saw Elsie's death as a flaw in his family's perfect facade. not a tragedy. Hayes realized the horrifying dynamic: Clara's trauma, seeking stillness to stop the change, and Elias's trauma, seeking order to erase the flaw, had converged. When the boys began to show signs of illness, another flaw, Clara's madness saw a solution in forma stabilis, and Elias's need for order saw a path to quiet, permanent concealment. He allowed the process to continue because the alternative, the social ruin of a messy, imperfect family, was, to his mind, worse than the chemical preservation of his sons. Hayes left Amelia, the gray skies of Willow Creek reflecting the gloom in his mind. The town had enabled the crime by valorizing the appearance of order and respectability above genuine human connection and emotion. Elias was a product of a society that prioritized facade over feeling. His final action was to ensure the scientific horror was fully understood. The scientific community, once they saw Vance's journals and the physical evidence, was in uproar. Hayes spent weeks with chemists, ensuring the formula for forma stabilis, now a symbol of scientific perversion, was completely neutralized and destroyed. The last trace of the horror, the compound itself, had to be eradicated. The Thorn house was torn down within the year, the land purified and resold. The couch, the silent centerpiece of the crime, was taken to a secure, distant research facility, not as evidence of murder, but as a chilling, permanent monument to the terrifying power of human trauma and complicity. Clara, in prison, found her ultimate stillness. She became a model inmate, quiet, detached, and utterly convinced of her own tragic victory. Elias served his time, emerging 10 years later, a ghost of a man. He moved away, never to be heard from again, his sentence of moral failure far harsher than the decade he served. The fate of Caleb and Ethan Thorn, the melted figures on the couch, became a dark, whispered legend forever etched into the history of Willow Creek. The small town learned a painful, indelible lesson that the most terrifying evils do not come from the supernatural, but from the quiet, corrosive psychological pressures that force good people to become complicit in unspeakable acts. The silence they all cherished had finally screamed the truth. 10 years had passed since the forma stabilis murders shocked Willow Creek. The year was 1903. Detective Arthur Hayes, now a seasoned veteran with a reputation forged in the crucible of that horrific case, received a curious, almost unsettling request. Elias Thorn, having served his full sentence, had been released and was briefly sighted in a transient boarding house on the outskirts of Albany. Hayes was requested to simply confirm Elias's identity and status. The request was more a formality, yet Hayes felt a pull back to the man whose complicity had been as devastating as his wife's madness. Hayes found Elias in a cheap, sparsely furnished room. The man who had once been a meticulous carpenter was now gaunt, disheveled, and completely detached from the world. Elias sat by the window, not looking out, but staring at his own hands, calloused and rough, yet now utterly idle. "Mr. Thorn," Hayes said, his voice quiet. "I'm here to confirm your release. How are you adjusting?" Elias didn't look up. His voice was a flat monotone. "Stillness, detective. I have finally achieved my own stillness. No noise, no carpentry, no need for order. It's peaceful." The word stillness, once Clara's horrifying mantra, now coming from Elias, sent a shiver down Hayes's spine. Elias had internalized the core pathology of his wife's madness. He hadn't recovered from his moral failure. He had simply retreated into a psychological void, a self-imposed prison of apathy. Hayes, driven by a decade of unresolved professional curiosity, pressed him on the final detail of the case: the ceramic doll. The doll, Elias, the one Clara's father valued. You kept it in the crate. Why? Why keep the symbol of Clara's final, perfect act? Elias's hands trembled, and he finally looked at Hayes, his eyes holding a profound, empty sorrow. "She said it was the witness. She said as long as the witness was safe, their permanence would be complete. I was afraid, detective. Not of the law, but of her. She had a power over me, a fear she instilled, the fear of things falling apart, the fear of being found out. He reached beneath his pillow and slowly pulled out a small, worn piece of velvet, the exact crimson shade of the infamous couch. I took this from the parlor before they sealed it off. I carry it always. Hayes realized the terrible irony. Elias had become the ultimate victim of the former Stabilis project. He had been chemically and psychologically fused to the memory of his children's death, just as they were fused to the couch. He would never be free of the crime. Elias, Hayes said, stepping closer, you did a terrible thing by staying silent. You betrayed your sons. But you were also a victim of a deep, familial trauma that you didn't understand. Elias smiled, a faint, heartbreaking, vacant expression. Victim or monster? Does it matter, detective? The boys are still. And I am still. We both achieved what Clara wanted in the end. Quiet. Hayes left the room, the scent of dust and stagnation following him. The encounter offered no dramatic confession or final twist, but a deeper, more chilling psychological truth. The full measure of the crime was not the murder, but the profound, lasting psychological damage it inflicted on everyone involved. The investigation, however, offered a strange solace to Hayes. He had encountered a new kind of evil, one that wore the face of domestic respectability and used the tools of science, not superstition. He understood that the true defense against such terror was not bravery, but vigilance against the insidious creep of social pressure, denial, and the demand for perfection. Hayes returned to the city, the weight of the Willow Creek case forever on his shoulders. The Thorn tragedy became a benchmark in criminal psychology, a non-supernatural horror rooted entirely in human failure. The mother's madness, the father's cowardice, the uncle's obsession, and the town's silence. All the elements had converged to create a unique and terrifying chapter in the annals of American crime, a permanent reminder that some truths are too horrifying to be dismissed as simple insanity. The story of the mother who melted her sons into the couch, or the former Stabilis murders, faded from the front pages but settled permanently into the cultural consciousness of the region. Detective Arthur Hayes never fully escaped the case. It shaped his career, making him a pioneer in the early fields of criminal profiling and forensic psychology. He was one of the first to argue in court that severe, inherited psychological trauma could manifest in meticulously planned, non-spontaneous acts of violence. Hayes's greatest achievement post-Thorn was not another arrest, but his successful advocacy for the implementation of the first state-level child welfare check laws. Influenced by Amelia Rutledge's initial frustrated attempt to involve Constable Sterling, Hayes argued passionately that the privacy of the home could not supersede the welfare of a child, especially when clear warning signs like prolonged silence, isolation, and strange odors were present. The law, passed in 1905, became known informally as the Caleb and Ethan Act. Amelia Rutledge dedicated her remaining years to local charity work, her initial brave act of moral conviction a small defiant light against the immense shadow of the Thorn house. She ensured the children of Willow Creek were always seen, always heard, and never again allowed to fade into a terrifying silence behind sealed doors. Robert Vance's legacy became a dark footnote in chemical history. His former Stabilis formula, a macabre theoretical concept, a chilling example of scientific brilliance perverted by human obsession. The unique mineral catalyst, sourced from the Thorn property, was mined and officially neutralized by the state to prevent any attempt at recreating the horrific compound. Clara Thorn died quietly in prison 20 years after her conviction. She never spoke another word about the boys, having achieved the ultimate unassailable stillness she craved. Her final act was a brief, coded will that simply bequeathed the preserved velvet patch and the ceramic doll to Elias. Elias, still a withdrawn, silent figure in Albany, received the items. He immediately and methodically burned the doll, the final symbol of his wife's madness, and buried the velvet patch in a field, finally taking an active, decisive step against the stillness he had allowed to paralyze him for so long. The most enduring, chilling detail of the entire saga remained the couch. It was stored deep within a secure, climate-controlled vault at a university research facility. It was not viewed as a morbid exhibit, but as a forensic specimen, a testament to the chemical reaction, the temperature control, and the horrifying precision of Clara's method. Scientists studied it not for forma stabilis, but to understand the limits of human-made preservation on organic material. The figures of Caleb and Ethan Thorne, forever fused to the crimson velvet, remained. They were permanent, as Clara had wished. They were a material, immutable record of a psychological horror. The lack of decay, the unnatural preservation, meant that even decades later, they would appear exactly as they did on that terrible October day in 1893. The true terror of the case lay not in the physical act, but in the psychological landscape it exposed. The perversion of love, the way profound maternal grief, the loss of Elsie, was twisted by inherited trauma, the father's obsession with stillness into an act of ultimate possessive cruelty, the paralysis of fear. Elias Thorne's tragic failure was a demonstration of how fear of social ruin and the erosion of reputation can outweigh the most fundamental human instinct, the protection of one's children. The danger of silence. The crime thrived in the quiet, orderly facade of Willow Creek, a town that prioritized peace and appearances over checking on a neighbor's well-being. The story of the mother who melted her sons into the couch was a psychological thriller played out in the claustrophobic confines of a single American Victorian home. It proved that the most frightening monsters are not mythical, but are forged in the crucible of human trauma, denial, and the terrifying belief that absolute perfection can only be achieved through absolute stillness. The final image, the two small permanent forms resting on the blood-red velvet, was not one of rest, but of an eternal, terrifying stillness, a perpetual echo of the pain and terror that had finally brought the House of Thorne down. The memory of the boys, trapped forever in their gruesome domestic pedestal, served as Willow Creek's permanent, silent lesson.